So the Trump DOJ just escalated its nationwide push against bans on so-called assault weapons and magazine bans as well, and they've done this in a massive way. Not only has the administration already sued Denver over its AR-15 ban, but now the DOJ has officially filed a second lawsuit directly against the state of Colorado over their magazine ban. And the language coming from the administration is becoming even more aggressive. Harmeet Dillon and the DOJ are now openly arguing that these bans violate the Second Amendment because they restrict these types of arms that are protected, but also at the same time, the administration continues to signal that its broader goal is to push these issues to Supreme Court review. And they have even made affirmative statements that they believe the Supreme Court will eventually strike these bans down nationwide. So let's break down what is now happening with these new challenges and how this impacts the future of these bans nationwide. Now, before we jump into this video, if you want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply by subscribing. You can also hit the like button that just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this type of content, and so it shares it with more people. I also want to thank one of the main supporters of this channel, which is Attorneys on Retainer. When it comes to self-defense protection, in my opinion, AOR is in a league of their own. They're backed by an actual law firm, the Attorneys for Freedom, and they're always trying to expand upon their benefits to give you as much as possible as a member. And right now, if you sign up using my link down below and you use my code ARMEDSCHOLAR, you can get $50 off of your individual sign-up fee or $25 off of the family fee. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, the DOJ has already sued the city of Denver over its AR-15 ban. We talked about that in a prior video, and they argue that the city was violating the Second Amendment by prohibiting firearms that are commonly owned by law-abiding Americans for lawful purposes. But now the administration has expanded upon those efforts and this fight, and they officially sued the state of Colorado as well over the statewide ban on magazines. The DOJ complaint directly attacks Colorado's prohibition on so-called LCM, so magazines that hold more than 10 rounds, arguing that these are not unusual accessories at all, but rather they're standard capacity magazines that come standard with many of the most popular firearms and rifles in America, including AR-15s. The complaint says that the phrase LCM itself is very misleading and politically charged because these magazines are standard equipment for many, commonly owned firearms, and a lot of companies just ship these types of magazines standard with these items. That language also mirrors the administration's broader attack on the terminology that is also surrounding other issues and other items like AR-15s and those types of bans, and how states and cities and localities tried to identify those items as so-called assault weapons. Now, one of the most important parts of this lawsuit is that the DOJ is explicitly arguing that magazines themselves are protected arms under the Second Amendment. The complaint explains that detachable magazines are necessary for many semi-automatic firearms to function as designed. And because of that, the DOJ argues that these magazines fall within the plain text of the Second Amendment itself as protected arms. Now, that is a major position that the federal government is now taking, and that is a very pro-2A position, because for years, states defending magazine bans have tried to argue that magazines are merely accessories or outside the core protections of the Second Amendment. But now the DOJ is taking the exact opposite position, and they're supporting the pro-2A side. The administration is also relying heavily on the Supreme Court's common use framework that they outlined in Heller and Bruin. The lawsuit repeatedly emphasizes that law-abiding Americans own hundreds of millions of these magazines that would be banned under the Colorado state law. The DOJ even cites prior admissions from the state of Colorado itself, acknowledging that millions of these magazines exist in Colorado alone and that they are commonly used for lawful purposes, including self-defense. And that is also critical under Heller in that analysis. The DOJ's argument is basically this: if millions upon millions of Americans lawfully own these magazines, then the government cannot simply criminalize them nationwide and cannot just also outright ban them within an entire state. Now, this also ties directly into the statements Harmeet Dillon recently made about AR-15 bans and the actions that they're taking against this city of Denver. As we discussed previously, Harmeet Dillon openly stated that the administration believes that the Supreme Court is eventually going to rule that AR-15s are protected nationwide. And more importantly, she said that the DOJ in her office intends to help make that happen. She specifically pointed to Heller and Bruin, explaining that firearms commonly owned by law-abiding Americans are presumptively protected under the Second Amendment. And according to Harmony Dillon, that leads to what she called the inexorable conclusion that AR-15 bans are unconstitutional. Now the administration is applying that exact same theory to these magazine bans as well. And this is where the strategy really becomes clear for the DOJ. The DOJ knows that there are major cases already pending around the country, and many are actually in front of the Supreme Court dealing with rifle bans and magazine bans. You have the Duncan versus Bonta case that's in front of the Supreme Court. That comes out of the Ninth Circuit, and that deals with California's magazine ban. You have the NAGR versus Lamont case that's also in front of the Supreme Court. And then you have the Illinois Pica case that deals with Illinois' ban on rifles and magazines. That's in front of the Seventh Circuit. And then you have the New Jersey ANGRPC case, again dealing with New Jersey's ban. That's in the Third Circuit en banc panel, and it's still also pending a ruling. With all of this, there are growing splits and arguments from these lower courts over how to apply Bruin and how they should apply to these types of rifle bans and magazine bans. Some courts are upholding them outright. Others are increasingly kind of questioning whether bans on commonly owned firearms and magazines can survive under the Second Amendment at all. And now the DOJ is no longer waiting on the sidelines and waiting for the courts to essentially address these other cases. They're actively filing lawsuits themselves in an effort to push these issues towards eventual Supreme Court review. And honestly, this is one of the biggest shifts that we've ever seen with modern federal, Second Amendment litigation, because for years, the DOJ often defended these types of federal firearms restrictions and state restrictions. Oftentimes, you even saw like the Biden administration jump in support of certain state bans. But now we have a DOJ that is actively kind of championing the pro-2A side in filing lawsuits against cities and states that have these types of bans. They are filing affirmative lawsuits against states and cities, and they're aggressively invoking Heller and Bruin to fight back against these laws. And they're openly discussing the goal of actually securing a nationwide Supreme Court ruling to protect AR-15s and also these standard capacity magazines. That is a dramatic shift in how the federal government is now approaching this Second Amendment issue. Now, realistically, these cases are still going to take time. There will be motions, appeals, and eventually potentially direct Supreme Court review of these cases. But what matters right now is the direction that the DOJ is taking. The administration is clearly trying to build momentum towards a Supreme Court showdown over AR-15 bans and magazine bans as well. And through these lawsuits, the DOJ is effectively sending a clear message. If the Supreme Court does not resolve these issues that are already pending in front of them through existing cases, well, then the administration intends to keep pushing new cases and new challenges until eventually the Supreme Court is forced to actually address this issue. So these lawsuits against Denver and Colorado may end up becoming much bigger than just this local dispute and these local issues and this one specific state ban, because the Trump DOJ is now openly positioning itself to challenge AR-15 bans and magazine bans nationwide. And Harmony Dillon is openly saying that the administration intends to push these issues towards Supreme Court review. But now really the big question becomes, how will the Supreme Court eventually address this? Are they going to step in on some of those cases that are already pending in front of them? Or are they simply going to wait until the Trump DOJ pushes one of these cases in front of them? So that's an issue and a question that we still don't know yet. And we should have more clarity by the end of this term on whether the Supreme Court wants to address cases that are already pending in front of them. So that's the latest development in the growing fight over AR-15 bans and magazine bans and the administration's current push towards a major Supreme Court ruling. As these cases continue to move and develop, I will let you guys know. If you have any questions, go ahead and comment down below, and I will try to answer to the best of my ability. Also, if you like this video and you would like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply by liking, commenting, and subscribing. All of those things help to fuel the algorithm and just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this type of content, and so it shares it with more people. But as always, thank you so much for all of your support, and never forget this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.